4 men, chained to posts in the Texas canyon, left to die under a sun that didn't ask questions. Every rider on Cimarron Trail that afternoon saw them. Every single one, and every single one kept riding. Then she came around the bend, 19 years old. 1 horse, no weapon. The men who did this were still armed, still close, and she knew it. She stopped anyway. What nobody knew, not her, not the 4 bleeding strangers she was about to free with a rock and a leather strap and bare hands, was who she had just unchained, and what that name was about to set in motion. 3 weeks later, a courtroom in Amarillo went completely silent when a lawyer pointed at her and said she had no one to stand behind her. He was wrong. The road had a name on no map Elsa Reed had ever seen. Cimarron Trail. That was what the old men called it when they spat tobacco juice off the porch of Hollis House and talked about the days when cattle drives ran north through the canyon country like brown rivers with hooves. Now it was just a 2-lane cut through red clay and limestone, mesquite pressing in from both sides like walls that had forgotten they were trees, and the kind of silence that sits on your chest and reminds you that you are very small and the land is very old. Elsa knew this road. She had walked it twice a week for 3 years. First with her father's mending basket over one arm, then alone, then with the basket replaced by a leather satchel that held her measuring tape and her order book, and the $4 in folded bills she kept behind the front cover, in case the axle of the Hooper wagon threw a wheel and she needed to pay someone to haul the fabric back on their own horse. She knew the dead juniper at the first bend that leaned west like a man who had been listening to the wind for too long. She knew the place where the clay went soft after rain and Pepper's front hooves would sink an inch before finding purchase. She knew the mile markers, painted numbers on flat limestone slabs set into the earth by some county surveyor in 1871, because she had counted them so many times they felt like old acquaintances. Not friends, just familiar faces. Milepost 7 was where she always stopped. Not because anything waited there, because it was the point where the trail curved around a limestone shelf, and the whole panhandle opened up in front of you, grass running flat to the horizon in every direction, sky bigger than anything a person raised inside 4 walls could be prepared for, the afternoon light coming in from the southwest, at an angle that turned everything gold and a little unreal. Her father had stopped there too. She had ridden behind him on his gray horse when she was 7, 8, 9, her arms around his waist, and he had always paused at milepost 7 without being asked and without explaining why. She understood now. Some places are worth pausing at, not because they give you anything, because they remind you what you're looking at when you look at the world. She would have paused there today, except she never made it to milepost 7. She was still 200 yards short, Pepper walking slow in the heat when she heard it. Not an animal. She had heard plenty of animals in distress. This was not that. This was a human voice stripped of everything except the bare mechanical fact of air moving through a throat. Hoarse. Almost gone. Like someone who had been calling out for a very long time into a place where no one came. Elsa stopped Pepper. She sat in the saddle and looked up and down the trail, empty in both directions as far as she could see. Looked at the limestone shelf to her left, to the cut in the rock where the trail bent. Looked right toward the mesquite, and the canyon edge where the brush got thick and the ground dropped away in a series of red clay terraces down toward the dry creek bed 40 feet below. The sound was coming from that direction, from somewhere past the brush line, past where any reasonable person had a reason to be on a Thursday afternoon in July. She checked Pepper's ears. The horse had them rotated toward the brush, which meant the sound was real, which meant she had not imagined it. A wagon appeared around the bend from the south. Thomas Hooper's rig, his gray mule team pulling a covered bed, Hooper himself up on the box with his hat pulled low against the sun. He was the reason she was out here. He always came through on Thursdays with the bolt fabric she had ordered from the dry goods supplier in Amarillo. He slowed the team when he came around the bend, because the trail was narrow here, and he always slowed at the bend. He looked toward the brush. He looked at Elsa. He did not stop. He shook the lines and the mules stepped out and the wagon rolled past her without Hooper meeting her eyes once. She watched the wagon go. Then a pair of riders appeared from the north, working men by the look of them. Worn gear, dusty horses. They came around the shelf at a trot, saw the brush, looked at each other. The man in front touched his hat brim at Elsa in the old way that meant acknowledgement without obligation. They did not slow. They passed her in a canter, and the sound of their horses faded south. Elsa sat in the saddle for a moment longer. She thought about her father, Thomas Reed, who had been a man the size of a barn door, and the quietest person she had ever known, who had put down his hammer at the end of every day and walked through Redstone Creek with his hands open, not because anyone was watching, but because that was the only way he knew how to walk. He had died in the dark, 40 feet underground, in a collapse that was not supposed to happen, in a shaft that was not supposed to fail, and 3 men who had been standing at the shaft collar had run when the timbers gave and the roof came down. They had run and not looked back, and not called for help, and not gone for the foreman, and not done anything except get themselves out. By the time anyone went down for her father, it was too late for anything except bringing him up. She had been 14. She had learned that day that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people. She had spent the 5 years since making very sure she knew which kind she was. She tied Pepper to a mesquite trunk and walked into the brush. 40 yards in, the ground opened into a flat clearing between the canyon wall and the first drop of the limestone terraces. She stopped at the edge of the brush line, and what she saw made her stand completely still for 3 full seconds before her mind caught up to her eyes. 4 men, all of them large, 2 of them enormous, tied to wooden posts with logging chain and hemp rope, the chain wrapped twice around each man's torso and cinched at the post with iron padlocks, their wrists bound separately behind them with cord. Their horses were gone. Their hats were gone. One of them had a gun belt still buckled, but the holster was empty. They had been here long enough that the 3 men who were conscious had stopped fighting the restraints and were simply enduring. The 4th man, the biggest one, was only half conscious, his head dropping forward and snapping back up and dropping again, blood from a gash above his left ear drying brown in the heat, the flies finding it. The canyon wall behind them held the heat like an oven door. Elsa did a thing her father had taught her, and that she had never been able to explain to anyone, because it was not the kind of thing that had words around it. She stopped. She looked. She counted what she had. She counted what she needed. She did not move until she understood the gap between those 2 numbers and had an idea about how to close it. 4 men. One with a head wound and heat sickness setting in. He went first because he had the least time. One with his right wrist wrapped in cord, cinched tight enough that the hand was turning the dark purple-gray of a thunderhead. He went second because that hand would be permanent damage in another 30 minutes. One who had been the one calling out, whose voice was gone to nothing, who was sitting upright, but whose lips had cracked white and whose eyes were fixed on her. With the expression of a man who no longer believed what he was seeing, he went third. And the 4th one. The 4th one was different from the beginning. He was sitting with his back straight against the post. Not rigid, not fighting it. Straight, the way a man sits straight when that is simply how he sits. He was the one with the deepest chest and the broadest shoulders, and the gray in his dark hair was the kind that came from years rather than worry. The blood on his brow had dried and cracked at the corner of his left eyebrow. His hands were bound like the others, but his wrists were not straining against the cord. He was looking at her with gray eyes that did not match the situation. Calm the way deep water is calm, which is not the same as shallow water being calm. He had been watching her since the moment she came out of the brush. Get yourself back on the trail. His voice was low and level. Not a command issued from fear, a recommendation from a man who had assessed the situation and arrived at a conclusion he believed was in her best interest. The men who did this were armed. They left on horseback. They may not have gone far. Elsa looked at the man with the dropping head. She looked at the purple hand. Then I need to be fast. She set down her leather satchel and went to work. First, the man with the purple hand. She knelt beside him and looked at where the cord met his wrist. The knot was a simple cinch pulled to compression. Not a sailor's knot, not anything complicated. The kind of knot a man ties when he is in a hurry and has no reason to think the person he is tying will have anyone to untie them. She had her fabric knife in the satchel, a short-bladed folding knife, with a handle worn smooth from years of cutting canvas and wool. She opened it and pressed the blade against the cord, and the cord parted in 2 strokes. The man's arm dropped. He pulled his hand around in front of him and looked at his own fingers as if he was not sure they were still his. Don't flex it. She was already moving. Give it a minute or you'll cramp the tendons. Ray Sutton, though she did not know his name yet, stared at her. Where did you come from? The trail. She was beside the unconscious man now. Buck Dillon, though she did not know that either. She put her hand on his forearm and checked for the pulse at the inside of his wrist. The way her father had shown her when she was 12. And he had pulled a ranch hand out from under a horse that had rolled. Pulse was there, fast, irregular. She looked at the gash, still seeping at the center, dry and crusted at the edges, which meant it had been bleeding for some time but was slowing. She took the handkerchief from her satchel pocket, the clean one she always kept folded in the left side, because the right side held her measuring tape, and she folded it into a compress. She pressed it to the wound. Buck's head moved. His eyes came partway open. Hold still. His eyes found her face and held there, confused and not yet alarmed, which was the better of the two options. She turned to the man with the cracked lips. Jed Marsh, though she would learn that later. She had half a canteen of water on Pepper. She told him she would be back with it in a moment, and he nodded, barely, the smallest movement, his jaw working without sound. Talk to the big one, she told Ray, who was cradling his own hand against his chest. Keep him from going back under. Can you do that? Yes. No hesitation. He shifted his position and angled toward Buck and began to speak to him in a low, continuous voice. The kind of voice people use when they are talking someone back from a long way off. She ran back through the brush to Pepper, unhooked the canteen from the saddle, looked at the yoke strap connecting the saddle to the girth. It was a wide leather strap with a brass D-ring on each end, the kind of strap that could be unthreaded from the saddle rings without a tool if you knew the order to work the leather through. She knew the order. Her father had taught her every piece of a horse's tack before he had let her ride without him. She worked the strap loose in 40 seconds and took it back into the brush. She gave the canteen to Jed first, not the whole thing. 3 small swallows, counted out, not negotiable. His throat worked around each one like a man learning to swallow again. She put the compress back on Buck's head and told Ray to hold it there, and Ray did. Then she took the D-ring strap to the chains. The gray-eyed man had been watching everything. The padlocks are iron, he said. Standard freight locks. You won't break the shackle without a bolt cutter or a key. I'm not going for the locks. She was crouching at the base of the post, looking at the chain where it lay against the ground. The chain was wrapped twice around the post and the man's torso, which meant the length of the chain was fixed, but the tension was not. A chain that is wrapped and locked is not the same as a chain that is welded. It has play. It has gaps where the links interact, and it had to be draped over the man and the post from above, which meant the attacker had set the wrap at height, not at the base. They chained you standing up, then made you sit. A pause, yes, so the lowest loop has slack. She was threading the D-ring strap through a gap in the bottom loop of the chain, working it through the space between 2 links, folding the strap back on itself to create a lever. Give me something to brace against. He extended his boot toward her. She braced the strap against the toe of his boot and pulled. The chain groaned. The bottom loop spread 2 inches. She moved the strap to the next link and pulled again. The second link spread. She kept moving. You know mechanical advantage, the gray-eyed man said. My father was a blacksmith. She did not look up. He said everything that moves has a reason it moves and a reason it doesn't. Find one of those reasons and you have leverage. Something in his face changed. She did not see it because she was not looking at his face. But she would have known, if she had looked, that it was not gratitude. It was recognition. The expression of a man who has heard a language spoken that he thought only he knew. The chain loosened enough for her to work it upward over the post cap, and then it fell. The gray-eyed man stood without hurrying, the way he did everything, and rolled his wrists forward and braced them briefly on his thighs. She was already at the post beside him, working on the second set of chains for Jed Marsh. There's a key, the gray-eyed man said. They took it off Hank's vest and threw it into the brush, to the left of where you came in. I watched where it landed. She stopped, looked at him. 12 feet in, past the tall clump of yellow grass. Near a flat rock, she went. It took her 4 minutes to find it because the light was wrong under the mesquite branches and the key had bounced. But she found it, a standard iron padlock key on a small ring, half buried under a shelf of dead grass. She came back and tried it on Jed's padlock. It opened. She moved to Buck, opened his. She and the gray-eyed man got Jed and Buck each freed of the chains at the same time. And then the gray-eyed man lifted Buck under the arms, as if Buck weighed nothing at all, and settled him against the canyon wall in the shade of the limestone overhang, where the air was 3 degrees cooler. She had not had time to think about who these men were. She had not asked, not their names, not where they were from, not what they were doing on Cimarron Trail, not why they had been the target of men with chains and padlocks. There was a reason for all of that, and the reason was time. Questions are for after. You deal with what is in front of you first and sort out the backstory when the immediate crisis has stopped being immediate. Now she stopped. Looked at the 4 of them. Buck was propped in the shade with Ray keeping the compress to his head. Jed was sitting against the wall with the canteen, taking small careful swallows. The gray-eyed man was standing 3 feet from her, watching her take stock of the situation the same way she was taking stock of it. Both of them running the same calculation at the same time. He needs a doctor, she said, meaning Buck. Yes. Can he ride, not alone? She looked at Pepper, tied outside the brush, 1 horse, 5 people. Buck, who could not sit a saddle without support. 3 miles to Redstone Creek on a day when the trail had shown her very clearly that no one passing through was going to stop. Then we walk. Your man rides with one of you behind him. I'll walk alongside and keep the compress on him. She looked at the gray-eyed man. You're the biggest. You ride double better than the others. That horse of yours will carry double in this heat. Pepper carried my father and me together when I was 9, and he weighed 220 pounds. She complains about it, but she does it. She was already moving toward the brush line to retrieve Pepper. Come on, we're losing afternoon. What she did not see as she walked out of the clearing to get her horse was the gray-eyed man standing very still with his hands loose at his sides, watching her go. And she did not hear, because she was out of earshot, the thing he said quietly enough that only Jed, who was closest, caught it. It was 4 words. Jed would repeat them to Ray later that evening. In the low voice men use when they are talking about something they are not sure they have the right to discuss. Find out her name. The walk back to Redstone Creek was 3 miles on a trail that offered no shade for the first 2 of them. Elsa walked on the right side of Pepper, her hand up and braced against Buck's hip to keep him from listing to the left, which was the direction he tended to list when his head went heavy. The gray-eyed man sat behind Buck with 1 hand on the saddle horn and 1 arm across Buck's chest in a loose brace, controlling the drift. He was good on horseback in the wordless way that means someone who has spent most of their life in the saddle. He adjusted to Pepper's rhythm without thinking about it. Ray and Jed walked on the other side. Ray's color was coming back. Jed had the canteen looped over his shoulder and was taking small swallows every few minutes and not talking, which suited Elsa fine. She was not in the mood for talking. She was in the mood for getting to Redstone Creek. Before the light shifted and before Buck's half-consciousness tilted further in the wrong direction, she thought about the gash above his ear. Head wounds bled impressively and healed without consequence, or they stopped bleeding. And the skull was not the only thing that had been damaged. Dr. Ward would know the difference. He was 71, and his hands shook on cold mornings, and his eyesight had gone soft at the edges, but his judgment was still sound, and his nerve never left him. And those 2 things mattered more than steady hands and good eyes when someone's skull needed examining. She thought about the key she had found. 12 feet into the brush, past the yellow grass, near a flat rock. The gray-eyed man had been watching where it landed when the men who had chained him had thrown it. He had been chained to a post in a canyon clearing in the middle of July, bleeding from his head, and he had been watching where the key went. Not panicking, not pleading, not even bargaining, watching, filing it away, waiting for someone who could use the information. She did not know what to do with that. So she tucked it aside and kept walking. The first building of Redstone Creek came into view at the top of the last rise, the gray timber wall of the livery stable, with its rusted iron weather vane. A rooster missing 1 tail feather that had been missing 1 tail feather for as long as Elsa could remember. She had a feeling in her chest that was not quite relief, because she would not allow herself relief before the situation was fully resolved. But it was the first cousin of relief, the cousin who shows up early and sits in the corner. Redstone Creek was not a large town. It had been larger. 15 years ago, when the cattle drives came through regularly and the freighting companies used it as a way station, it had 2 hotels and a bathhouse and a hardware store with a proper plate glass window. The window was still there, but it had cracked in the winter of 1879, and been replaced with oiled paper that had yellowed and now let in light of the color of old teeth. The hardware store had become a feed and grain. One hotel had become a storage barn. The other hotel had become Hollis House, which was what everyone called the combination rooming house and dining room that Ruth Hollis ran from a 2-story clapboard building on the east side of the main street. The bathhouse was still a bathhouse, but it only opened on Tuesdays and Saturdays. The town had a population of 340 people, who were mostly staying because they had nowhere specific to go or something specific keeping them, and it had the quality that all such towns have, of existing primarily in the present tense, of not spending much energy on what had been or what might be, but on the particular requirements of this particular Thursday, a Thursday that was about to become somewhat less ordinary. She brought Pepper up the center of the street at a walk. People came out, not all at once. First it was Harlan Briggs from the farrier shop, who looked up at the sound of hooves and then stood up from where he had been crouching at a horse's hind leg. Then Ruth Hollis appeared in the doorway of Hollis House with a dish towel in her hands, the way she always appeared in doorways, as if she had been positioned there by design, and the doorway was her natural frame. Then old Seth Greer from the porch of what used to be the hotel, and was now where Seth Greer spent his afternoons regardless of what the building was called. Then more. Gradually, then all at once, the way things happen in small towns. No one called out. They looked at the 4 large men, the one slumped against the gray-eyed man on the horse, the torn and blood-stained shirts, the missing hats, the purple wrist that Ray Sutton was still cradling against his chest, even though the blood had fully returned and the hand was his own color again. They looked at Elsa, who was walking beside Pepper with her satchel over her shoulder, and her hair coming out of its pins from the heat and the effort, and on whose face was the expression she always had when she was managing a situation entirely focused, not alarmed, moving forward. Ruth Hollis had the door of Hollis House open before Elsa had stopped the horse. "Dr. Ward," Elsa said. She was helping ease Buck down from the saddle, the gray-eyed man taking most of the weight. "Someone go for Dr. Ward." Young Pete Callender, who worked the livery stable and was always underfoot in the way that young men are always underfoot in small towns, was already running before she finished the sentence. She had not looked at him. She had not needed to. Pete was reliable in the way that some young men are reliable before the world gets to them, which was something she appreciated even if she would not have said so. They got Buck inside and onto the long bench in the front room of Hollis House. The bench that Ruth Hollis kept there for exactly this kind of purpose, which was not specifically for unconscious men, but for whatever the day required. Ruth came in behind them with a basin of water that had been heated for the supper dishes, and a clean cloth that she handed to Elsa without being asked. Elsa cleaned the wound. It was a gash, not a fracture, 3 inches long, parallel to the hairline above the left ear, from the edge of what had probably been a pistol grip or a rifle stock. The depth was worrying, but the bone beneath it was intact. She had pressed enough compress cloths against enough farm injuries in her life to know what give in a skull felt like, and what it did not feel like, and this felt like what it should. She kept the cloth pressed against it and looked at Buck's eyes when they came open, which was inconsistently. Hank, the gray-eyed man, was beside her. He had moved there without sound. He put his hand on Buck's shoulder and spoke to him directly, quietly, the private communication of men who have worked together long enough that they don't need volume. "You're in town, you're all right, stay with me." Buck's eyes found the gray-eyed man's face and locked there. Elsa stepped back. She had been moving since the moment she had walked into that clearing. And now she was still, and her hands were at her sides, and she could feel her heartbeat for the first time in the better part of an hour. It was elevated. She had not noticed that while it was happening, which was something her father had told her about, that the body knows to wait until the crisis is over before it lets you feel what it has been carrying. She looked at her hands. The knuckles of her right hand were scraped from where she had braced against the limestone shelf, working the chain. She had not noticed that either. Ruth Hollis appeared at her elbow. Ruth was a small woman, compact, with the efficient quality of a person who has run a business alone for 20 years and has trimmed away everything that was not necessary to the operation. She was looking at Elsa's hand. "Come to the kitchen, I'm fine. You're bleeding on my floor." Ruth took her arm, not unkindly, and steered her toward the back of the house. At the kitchen table, Under the better light from the west-facing window, Ruth examined the scrape and produced a strip of clean cloth from the cabinet above the dry sink where she kept such things, the way people who feed and house the public always keep such things. She wrapped it with the competence of a woman who had seen every variety of minor injury that adults and adolescents and animals can produce and was not troubled by any of them. Elsa looked out the window while Ruth worked. The backyard of Hollis House, the garden Ruth kept, the vegetable rows running straight, the single pecan tree in the far corner that was old enough that no one alive in Redstone Creek remembered it being planted. The afternoon light through its branches made a shifting pattern on the ground that was peaceful in the absolute undeniable way that some things are peaceful. She breathed out, long and slow, the way her father had taught her to breathe after a thing was done. "Who are they?" Ruth said it without inflection, which was how Ruth said most things. "I don't know. They were on Cimarron Trail." She paused. "Someone chained them to posts in the canyon clearing below the limestone shelf, took their horses, left them." Ruth's hands had stilled on the cloth strip, briefly then continued. "Armed? The men who did it?" "Yes." Ruth tied off the bandage. She was quiet for a moment in the way Ruth Hollis was quiet when she was thinking something through. "And you walked into it. Someone had to. Plenty of people passed that road today, Elsa. I know." She looked at the pecan tree. "I know they did." The sound of boots on the front floorboards, deliberate and unhurried. She turned. The gray-eyed man stood in the kitchen doorway. He was taller than the doorframe required him to stoop, but he stooped anyway, the automatic courtesy of a large man who has spent his life being aware of the space he occupies. In the kitchen light she could see him more clearly than she had been able to in the canyon, where the brightness had flattened everything. His face was the kind of face that had been weathered by years outdoors. The lines at the corners of his eyes deep and permanent. The set of his jaw, a thing that did not change much whether he was talking or not. He had the blood on his brow cleaned away, which she had not seen happen, and someone had found him a cloth to replace the one he had lost, though it was Ruth's dish towel knotted loosely at the neck, and it did not fit the rest of him. He looked at the wrapped hand. How bad? Scraped. Not serious. She turned back to the window.
"How is your man?"
"Ward says he'll be all right. He needs rest and water, and he'll have a headache for a week. There's no give in the skull." He did not move from the doorway. "He said the same thing you did. About the bone." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You checked it," he said. "I know what it feels like when it's wrong. Most people don't. Most people haven't had reason to learn." She turned the rest of the way to face him. "You should let Dr. Ward look at your eyebrow. The cut is closed, but it should be cleaned. I've had worse. That's not the point." He looked at her for a moment, something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one in the same way the ghost of rain is in the air before the storm arrives. "No, it's not." Ruth Hollis had gone very still beside the dry sink in the specific way of a person who is not making herself invisible but is declining to be noticed. He reached into the pocket of his vest, a small pocket, tight to the body on the left side, and produced a ring. It was silver, heavy, with a symbol cut into the face of it. A star, but not a simple one. 8 points, arranged like compass directions, precise and clean. He held it out across the kitchen. "My name is Cole Harlan." She looked at the ring. Looked at him. Did not take the ring. "That's a name," she said. "It doesn't tell me much. It doesn't have to tell you much right now." He kept his hand out, not pushing. Simply patient. "My friends call it the compass star. It means something. I'll explain it someday if you'll let me." She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached out and took the ring, turned it over once in her palm, felt the weight of it, the cleanness of the engraved lines, the fact that whoever had made it had not been in a hurry. She set it on the kitchen table between them. Elsa Reed. She went back to looking out the window. Ruth Hollis looked at Cole Harlan. Cole Harlan looked at the ring on the table. He picked it up and put it back in his pocket, and looked at the back of Elsa Reed's pocket, and looked at the back of Elsa Reed's head for a moment that was several seconds longer than necessary, and then he went back to the front room. Ruth waited until his footsteps had moved far enough away. "Elsa, very quiet. Don't. I didn't say anything. You were about to." Ruth Hollis was quiet for a moment. "He's got a compass star ring, I noticed. Do you know what that means?" "No." "No," Ruth repeated. And then she said nothing else, which was worse than if she had said something, because the weight of what she was not saying was considerably heavier than any words she might have chosen. Dr. Ward came through the kitchen on his way to check on Ray Sutton's wrist, and stopped when he saw Elsa's hand. He looked at Ruth's bandaging work, prodded it once, and nodded with the minimal approval of a man who had been practicing medicine for 45 years, and had long since stopped being effusive about competence. "Good girl," he said, which was what he said to everyone, regardless of age or gender, when they had done a thing correctly, and went on through the back door. Elsa sat at the kitchen table and drank the cup of coffee Ruth put in front of her and looked at the pecan tree and listened to the sounds of Hollis House settling around her. Boots on the upper stairs. The murmur of voices from the front room. Ruth moving between the kitchen and the dining room, setting up for supper. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary establishment on an ordinary evening. Nothing about the last 2 hours had been ordinary. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She was also not going to make more of it than it was. She had heard something and stopped. She had looked at the problem and found the tools she had. She had done the work. The men were alive and the doctor had seen them, and they would be all right or they would not. But what she could do was done. She set down the coffee cup, picked up her satchel, checked the contents order book, measuring tape, fabric knife, handkerchief. Missing the D-ring strap from Pepper's saddle, which she had left in the canyon clearing. She would need to replace it. That was a cost. She calculated it against the money behind the front cover of the order book, and arrived at a number that was not comfortable but was manageable. She stood, and then the hinge on her satchel caught the edge of the table as she lifted it, and the whole bag tipped, and the front cover of the order book fell open, and the bills slid out onto the table along with the folded piece of paper she kept behind them. The paper unfolded itself as it fell, the way paper does when it has been folded and unfolded many times and has learned the shape of its own opening. She gathered the bills quickly, but the paper lay open on Ruth Hollis's kitchen table for 2 full seconds before she picked it up, and in those 2 seconds it was entirely readable to anyone standing at the kitchen doorway. The letterhead was clean black print, Denver Ladies Academy of Applied Sciences, Office of Admissions. The salutation beneath it began, "Dear Miss Reed, it is our great pleasure to inform you." She folded it and put it back and put the bills on top of it and closed the satchel. She looked at the doorway. Cole Harlan was not there. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding and felt, briefly and privately, like an idiot. She was 19 years old, and she was hiding a letter the way a child hides something she is ashamed of, and she was not ashamed of it. She was proud of it. She was proud of the fact that she had taken every piece of work Ruth Hollis threw her way and every hem and every custom order from the ranches outside of town, and every odd job of mending and alterations, and had saved every cent she could save and had submitted her application to Denver with the same careful precision she applied to a pattern cut, and had received an answer that told her she was precisely what she had believed herself to be. She was proud. She just could not afford to go. Those were 2 separate things. She went back to the front room. Ray Sutton was sitting up on a bench with his hand in a basin of water Ward had prescribed for the swelling. Jed Marsh had eaten 3 of Ruth's rolls, and was on his 4th, which was the appetite of a man whose blood sugar had been at the floor and was climbing back. Buck Dillon was on the long bench with a folded blanket under his head, eyes open and tracking now, which was significantly better than before. Cole Harlan was standing near the front window, looking out at the street. He had his back 3/4 to the room, which was the position of a man who is thinking rather than resting, who is present in the room but engaged with something the room cannot see. He turned when she came in. She did not stop moving. She went to check Buck's compress, changed it for a fresh cloth from Ruth's supply, checked his eyes again. "You should eat," Cole said. Not to Buck, to her. "I'm fine. You walked 3 miles in that heat and you haven't had water since before the canyon." She looked at the compress. "I'll get something from the kitchen before I go." "Before you go." He said it neutrally, but it was not entirely neutral. "I have supper to help with." She looked up. "Mrs. Hollis does breakfast and supper for her guests, and I help with supper in exchange for the room in the back." "That's tonight. I see." "I'm glad you're all right," she said, which was the truth, plainly stated. "I'm glad all 4 of you are all right. Dr. Ward knows what he's doing. Buck needs rest and water and he'll be fine. Your other men look well enough. They are, thanks to you." She picked up her satchel. "Good night, Mr. Harlan." He did not say anything immediately. She was almost to the hallway that led to the back of the house when he said, the same low level that he had used to speak to Buck, that he had used in the canyon, when he told her to get back on the trail. "What does it take to get there?" She stopped. She did not turn around. She was looking at the wallpaper in the hallway, dark roses on cream that had been there since Ruth's mother's time, and had faded to a pink that had no intention of ever being anything else. Denver, he said. She did not ask how he knew. She had a good idea, more than I have, she said. She went through to the kitchen, and Cole Harlan stood in the front room of Hollis House, and looked at the space where she had been standing, and said nothing to anyone, and looked at nothing in particular, and was very still for a very long time. Outside, 3 miles down Cimarron Trail at milepost 7, where Elsa had stopped earlier that afternoon and looked at the open panhandle, and in the gold-tilled light, a man stood behind a limestone shelf. Tall, lean, hat pulled low. He had been back once already since leaving the canyon, verifying that the horses were still where he had left them, tied behind the canyon wall on the south side. Now he stood at the shelf and looked toward Redstone Creek, where the evening lights were starting in the windows of the buildings along the main street. He could not see Hollis House from here, but he knew the layout of every town within 40 miles of Cimarron Trail, because knowing the layout of towns was how a man stayed ahead of the people who were looking for him. Wade Cutter had been a deputy sheriff in Haskell County for 6 years before the election that put Frank Mosley in the sheriff's chair, and the subsequent inquiry that put Cutter out of the chair he had been sitting in, the chair behind the county attorney's conviction records, where he had been very profitably sitting for most of those 6 years. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had made an accurate calculation that the legal system was a road with a center lane and 2 shoulders. And the people who got where they were going fastest were the ones who used all 3, and who had simply miscalculated once about how closely someone was watching his shoulder use. He had been watching the road today. He had seen the girl come around the curve from the north on the brown horse. He had seen her stop. He had seen 2 wagons and a pair of riders pass without stopping. He had watched her tie the horse and go into the brush. And he had watched her come out with all 4 of them an hour later, the big unconscious one on the horse with the Harlan man behind him. Harlan. Cole Harlan. He had recognized the profile when the afternoon light hit it right. The broad shoulders, the particular set of the man's posture in a saddle that a person did not forget once they had seen it across a stock auction ring in Tascosa 2 years ago. He had been careful since then to keep his operation off Harlan land and off the roads Harlan's men used regularly, and until today that had worked perfectly well. He had not known this was a Harlan party. They had been riding unmarked horses on a road they had no particular business on, at a time when they had no particular business on it, which was exactly the kind of discretion that created the confusion he was now in. He thought about the girl. He had seen her face clearly in the canyon, brown-red hair coming out of its pins, green eyes, straight nose, the kind of jaw that says something about a person before they have opened their mouth. She had moved through that clearing like someone who had a plan before she had a plan, like someone for whom the doing of necessary things was a reflex rather than a decision. She had not looked up at the ridge once, which meant she had not seen him, but she had seen the other 4 well enough to identify every one of them without question. She was a witness, the only civilian witness. The 4 men he had chained were Harlan men, and Cole Harlan would handle that the way Cole Harlan handled everything, which was with the weight of a man who owned 180,000 acres, and had the ear of the Haskell County Land Commission, and the Army quartermaster at Fort Elliott, and the patience of a man who knew that patience was a weapon. That was a problem for the future, manageable with time and distance. But a girl who had seen his face, and had no reason to leave Redstone Creek, and would walk into a county court and say what she had seen without flinching, because he had watched her that afternoon, and he knew the kind of woman she was. That was a problem for now. He turned his horse south. He had some thinking to do. In the kitchen of Hollis House, Elsa Reed put on her apron and began slicing the bread for supper, and did not think about Cole Harlan or Denver or the compass star ring or the way the canvas clearing had smelled of dust and heat and iron chain. She thought about the bread, whether the loaves had proofed long enough, whether Ruth had added the salt before or after the lard this time, because it made a difference in the crumb that Ruth always denied making a difference, but that definitely made a difference. She thought about the bread. She was very good at thinking about the bread. She did not think about the fact that she had been the only person on Cimarron Trail that afternoon who stopped. She did not think about what that said about anything. She sliced the bread and put it in the basket, and carried the basket to the dining room table, and set it in the center the way Ruth liked it, and she went back for the butter crock, and when she came back to the dining room she could see through the window that the evening light on the main street of Redstone Creek had gone the color of old copper, and the pecan tree in the back garden was throwing its last shadow of the day across the kitchen window in a long diagonal line. And it was, in every visible way, just another Thursday in July. Except that somewhere on the south end of Cimarron Trail, a lean man with a low hat was thinking about her face. And in the front room of Hollis House, Cole Harlan had not moved from where he was standing. And on the table beside the front window he had set down the compass star ring. He was looking at it. He did not pick it up again for a long time. He was gone when she woke up. She knew before she checked. The silence of Hollis House on a Friday morning had a texture she had learned over 3 years, and this particular Friday silence had something additional in it, a quality of recent departure, the way a room feels when the last person has left it not long ago, and the air has not yet settled back into itself. She lay on her narrow bed and listened to it and confirmed what she already knew, gone. Which was correct, which was the appropriate outcome. Men with ranches and contracts and 3 injured companions did not linger in Redstone Creek on Friday mornings, waiting for the town to notice them. They paid their bill and they rode. That was the sensible, proportionate response to having spent a night in someone else's town under someone else's roof. She got up at 4:45. She dressed without lighting the lamp, because she had dressed in this room, in the dark enough times to know where everything was by position and texture. Blouse first, the everyday one, 4 buttons at the collar, worn soft at the cuffs. Skirt, the dark wool, heavier than she needed in July but more durable than the cotton for workshop days. Apron last, tied at the back with the double knot that held all day without working loose. She did not think about Cole Harlan. She did not think about Cole Harlan, thinking about the man she had known for less than 48 hours, simply because he had gray eyes and the particular stillness of someone who listened to, more than he said. She had bread to check. Ruth had left 2 loaves to rise overnight, and the morning would tell whether the yeast had done its job, which was the kind of clear and answerable question she preferred to begin her days with. The bread had done exactly what bread does when left to its own devices in a warm kitchen overnight. She punched it down with both hands, reshaped the loaves, set them back to proof for the final rise. The work was rhythmic and satisfying in the way that all physical work is satisfying when the hands know what they are doing, and the mind can move at its own pace alongside them. Ruth came down at 5:15 and looked at the loaves already in the pans, and looked at Elsa standing at the window with a cup of coffee she had not been drinking, and said nothing for a moment in the way Ruth said nothing when she was deciding how much to say. He paid for everyone before he left. Ruth set her own cup on the table, cash on the front desk, correct amount for 4 rooms and supper. That's appropriate. He paid for the week. Elsa looked at her coffee. And he left something for you. Ruth produced a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket and set it on the table between them without pushing it forward or making any gesture that could be construed as pressure. Elsa looked at it. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it the way she looked at a seam she was about to open, assessing before committing. Then she picked it up. The handwriting was plain and even. The hand of a man who wrote practical correspondence regularly and had no interest in ornamentation. Not a long letter. 4 sentences. The D-ring strap is a debt I owe, not a courtesy. Your fabric order through Hooper has been settled directly. The Tuesday wagon will bring the bolt. No obligation is attached to either. Below that, a single initial, C. She folded it, put it in her apron pocket, went back to the bread. Ruth waited approximately as long as her nature allowed, which was not long. Well what, Elsa? He paid a debt, that's all it is. She checked the loaves. A man with a compass star ring and a well-made vest who pays his debts before he rides out. That's a fact about his character, not a conversation. Ruth looked at the wall above the bread pans, which was where Ruth looked when she was choosing not to look at Elsa's face. Buck Dillon told me last night, before they left. He said Cole Harlan hadn't spoken about anyone the way he spoke about you since. She stopped. Since his wife, Elsa said. Ruth was quiet. Mrs. Hollis. She turned from the bread. I'm 19 years old. I have a letter from Denver in a tin box under my bed, and $14 behind the front cover of my order book. Whatever Cole Harlan is or isn't thinking is not something I have the capacity to address right now. Ruth looked at her with the expression she used when she disagreed completely, but had decided to let time do the arguing. All right, thank you. I'll say one more thing. Of course you will. A man who pays a D-ring strapped dead in writing. Before dawn, when no one is watching him do it, Ruth picked up her coffee. That's not a man performing generosity. That's a man who knows exactly what he owes and to whom. She went to the dining room to set up for breakfast. Elsa stood at the window with her cold coffee and the bread rising in its pans, and did not think about the note in her apron pocket, which she had already read twice and did not need to read again, because she had the kind of memory that kept printed text without being asked. The Tuesday wagon came 4 days later and the fabric was on it. Not just the bolts she had ordered from Hooper. 3 additional bolts she had not ordered, paid in full on an invoice that listed them as standard order supplement with no name attached. She stood on the boardwalk outside Hollis House with the bolts in her arms, because Pete Calander had moved faster than her ability to object, and looked at the fabric. Good wool in a deep tobacco brown, canvas in the color of dry grass, the heavy durable kind that held its shape through a working season. A 3rd bolt of wool flannel in a dark slate that she had not seen in Hooper's catalog, and did not know how anyone had known to order. She took the fabric inside. She told herself this was practical. The fabric was good and it was paid for, and it was here and she could use it. She did not think about who had known to order the slate flannel. The contract work started the following Thursday. Not Harlan Ranch work, not yet. She had no measurements and no formal specifics. Only a verbal agreement made across a front room on a night when 4 men had been brought in off a trail and everything had been slightly unreal. She had begun to wonder if the agreement would arrive in the form of written terms, or simply evaporate the way verbal agreements sometimes did when the circumstances that produced them had passed. What came first was a family from the Sutton Creek area, with 3 growing boys who needed Sunday clothes before September, which was honest work at honest rates. She spent the morning measuring and cutting, with the focused pleasure she always brought to pattern work. The pleasure of a problem that had clear parameters and a correct solution that her hands knew how to find. She was pinning the first sleeve when she heard hooves on the main street. She kept pinning. Many people rode horses on many Thursdays. The hooves stopped in front of Hollis House. She pressed the next pin into the fabric exactly where it needed to go. Ruth appeared in the workshop doorway with her neutral face on, the version she used when she was withholding an opinion she had already formed. You have a caller, I have work. He has 4 bolts of heavy wool and a written list. She set the pin on the table. Cole Harlan was standing in the front room in the posture he used when he was being careful about the space he occupied, which was the center of the room, away from the walls, hat in both hands. He had ridden 40 miles that morning and found no particular reason to look as though he had. He was wearing the same vest she had seen him in before, now that she looked at it, the dark leather work vest, with the left pocket that sat close to his chest. The compass star ring was on his right hand. She had not noticed which hand before. He held up the bolts. For the contract, I should have sent the terms earlier. I apologize for the time. She looked at the bolts. You rode 40 miles to deliver fabric. I had county business in the area. This was efficient. Redstone Creek was not efficient from Harlan Ranch in any direction. She knew the roads. She took the bolts and set them on the cutting table, and took the list he produced from his vest and read it. 42 workers. Measurements to follow via Buck Dillon. Vests and working trousers for the full crew. Quality appropriate to hard daily use, not ceremony. Payment terms, half on delivery of measurements, half on completion. I'll need the measurements before I can begin cutting, she said. Send them with the next rider through. Buck will bring them himself. He passes through Redstone Creek on his way to the county land office next week. That works. She set the list next to the bolts. The additional fabric on Tuesday. The slate flannel. Hooper had surplus from an Amarillo supplier. She looked at him. He looked back without adjusting his expression. The slate flannel is not in Hooper's current catalog, she said. I know his catalog. I've ordered from it for 3 years. He sources outside the catalog for regular customers. I am a regular customer. He has never sourced outside the catalog for me. Cole said nothing for a moment. Then I added it to the contract invoice. You'll see it in Buck's accounting. It's not separate. She looked at the flannel. It was, she had to acknowledge privately, exactly the right weight and weave for working vests in a climate that ran from July heat to February cold. Someone who knew what ranch hands needed in the panhandle had selected it. She could not pretend it was not the right fabric, simply because she had not chosen it herself. 8 weeks for the full order, she said. From the date I receive measurements. I can give you 10, I said 8. I don't extend deadlines and I don't need the extra time. The ghost was there at the corner of his mouth, brief and controlled, less a smile than the muscular precursor of one. 8 weeks. He put his hat on. I'll have Buck here before Thursday. He moved toward the door. She had not planned to say anything else, but something he had done was sitting in her mind since Tuesday, and she had not found a clean place to set it down. The note you left. Before you rode out. He turned. You didn't have to write it down. I know. Most men would have left the money and considered the matter closed. I'm aware of that. He looked at her with the reading quality she had catalogued since the canyon, the attention that took in more than surface. A debt written down is a debt that exists independent of whether either party remembers it. I prefer debts to be clear. She looked at him for a moment. That's an unusual thing to prefer. I've found it saves considerable trouble. He left. She stood in the workshop and looked at the bolts of fabric on her cutting table, and the list of 42 names waiting for measurements, and thought about a man who wrote down his debts before dawn when no one was watching him do it. And she thought, I do not know what to do with someone like that. Which was not, she noted, the same as not wanting to know. Ruth appeared in the doorway approximately 3 seconds after the front door closed. This was the fastest Ruth had ever materialized from another room. It was almost impressive. Not a word, Elsa said. I was going to ask about breakfast, you were not. Ruth looked at the bolts of fabric. That's very good flannel. I know. Better than Hooper usually carries. Ruth, I'm discussing fabric, Elsa. It's a legitimate topic. She looked at the list on the cutting table. 42 men. Yes, that's a significant order. I'm aware. Ruth looked at her with the expression that meant she had said everything she intended to say and was satisfied with how much of it had landed. She went back to the kitchen. Elsa could hear, through the wall, the specific quality of her silence, warm, knowing, pleased with itself. She went back to the sleeve she had been pinning. Buck Dillon arrived on Wednesday rather than Thursday, which was either efficient or impatient, and Elsa chose to interpret it as efficient, because that was more useful. He came into the workshop with his hat in his hands and the measurements in a folded sheet of paper, in the other 42 entries in his blunt handwriting. Column after column of numbers that she checked twice against her pattern calculations and found accurate to a degree that told her he had measured carefully and more than once. His wrist had healed clean. The rope marks were gone. He held his coffee cup with his right hand without any adjustment or accommodation, which told her the circulation had returned fully. Good recovery, she said, meaning the wrist. Ward knows his business. He looked at the first completed sample vest she had hung on the wall hook. She had cut one from her own stock to establish the pattern before the Harlan wool arrived. He looked at it the way a man looks at work when he is assessing it seriously, and does not want to seem like he is assessing it. His thumb moved along the collar seam, which was where she had put the most care, the place where a poorly finished vest announced itself immediately. He did not change expression, but he touched the collar point again, which, from Buck Dillon, was a review. Tell Mr. Harlan the measurements are sufficient, and I'll begin cutting Monday, she said. I'll tell him. He folded the measurement paper she handed back, the copy she had made for her records. At the door her stopped, which was apparently something the Harlan men did. Miss Reed. She looked up. The man on the ridge that day, on Cimarron Trail. He was looking at the doorframe rather than at her, the posture of a man who wants to say something and has decided to say it sideways. Cole saw him. Before you came in, we all did. He filed it. She set down her pencil. He knew who it was. He had a good idea. He has a good idea about most things that move on those roads. Buck put his hat on. He didn't say anything that day, because you were already in, and there wasn't time, and saying it wouldn't have changed what needed doing. He looked at her then, directly, with the steady evaluation she had seen from him before. He's not a man who lets things go unaddressed. I thought you should know that. Why? Because you're in Redstone Creek alone. He said it without apology, not as a criticism but as geography. And because the man on that ridge is not done with what he started. He left. She sat at the cutting table for a while, after his boots faded from the porch. The workshop was quiet around her, The afternoon light coming through the west window at its late-day angle, long and flat across the cutting table. She thought about the ridge. About the fact that she had not looked up until the hawk led her eye there, which meant she had been visible in the clearing for the full duration of her time with the 4 men, visible and identifiable, and doing nothing to obscure the fact of her presence or her face. She had been there. She had seen. And she had walked out with all 4 of them in broad daylight on an open trail. She had not been thinking about being a witness. She had been thinking about getting 4 men out of a canyon in 100-degree heat before the day got worse. Those 2 things were now the same problem. She went back to work. The first night she heard something she had not heard before was 11 days after Buck's visit. She was deep enough in sleep that the sound arrived as part of a dream first. A scraping. Directional. The sound of something moving against the exterior east wall of the workshop at the foundation level. She came up out of sleep the way she came up out of most things, not gradually, but completely, all at once, her eyes open and her mind already sorting what she had heard from what she had been dreaming. She lay still and listened. The sound came again, a soft, deliberate scrape. Wood against stone or a boot sole against the foundation corner. The sound of something pressed against the base of the wall and then moved. Not wind, not an animal. Something with intention. She got up without lighting the lamp, crossed the workshop in the dark, which she could do because she knew this room by position and her feet knew the floor, and put her hand flat against the east wall and pressed her ear to it. The wood was warm from the day's heat. She listened, silence, a long minute of it, then movement going away, not running, not hurrying, the measured withdrawal of a person who had completed something and was leaving without urgency. She moved to the window and looked out at the yard, the dark garden, the gate at the far end that Ruth kept latched. The gate was swinging, not with wind, because there was no wind, with the residual motion of something that had just passed through it and released it. She stood at the window until the gate stilled. Then she went back to bed and lay in the dark and worked through the options. Coyote, no. A coyote did not move with that deliberate quality, did not press against a wall, did not exit through a latched gate. Drunk from the saloon, cutting through possible. But the gate would have made more noise, and a drunk moved differently from what she had heard. Someone with a reason to be at the base of her wall in the dark. Someone who had been there long enough to do something and had then left without apparent urgency. She thought about Buck's words. The man on that ridge is not done with what he started. She did not sleep again before the lamp-lighting hour. In the morning she found it at the base of the east wall, at the foundation where the board siding met the cart limestone that formed the lower foot of the building. A smear, dark, greasy, with a particular sharp sweetness of pine pitch, the residue of a torch held against dry wood long enough to leave a mark but not long enough to catch. Not an accident. An accident did not produce a mark of this precision, this location, this kind. An accident was random. This was an address. Someone had come to the base of her wall with a pitch torch and held it there and taken it away, and the mark they had left was a sentence she could read perfectly well. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she went inside and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking at the iron stove. Ruth kept banked overnight, the orange glow of the coals through the grate, and thought about what a person does with information they did not ask for and cannot give back. She told Ruth at breakfast. Ruth set her cup down with a quietness that was not calm but controlled. When? Sometime after midnight I heard them from inside, and the mark, east wall, base of the foundation, pitch torch. They had it against the wood long enough to leave a transfer mark but took it away before it caught. She looked at her coffee. They wanted me to find it in the morning. Ruth looked at the wall as if she could see through it to the mark outside. Her hands were flat on the table, which was what Ruth's hands did when she was thinking hard. You need to tell someone. I'm telling you. Someone with the ability to do something about it. Buck Dillon passes through on Tuesdays. She wrapped both hands around her cup. He said as much himself. The man from the ridge is not done. He was telling me to be watchful. I'm going to be watchful, and I'm going to tell Buck on Tuesday, and Buck will tell Cole, and Cole will... She stopped, reorganized. Buck will know what to do with the information. Ruth looked at her with the expression she used when she agreed with a plan and disagreed with the reasoning behind it simultaneously. She said, "The rider from the land office passed through yesterday morning. He goes back north on Friday. I could send a message with him directly. To Harlan Ranch. It would get there in a day, Ruth. I know. I'm not sending for him. Ruth looked at the table. No. All right. She picked up her cup. But you'll tell Buck Tuesday. Tuesday, Elsa agreed. She went to the workshop and picked up the day's work, which was the first set of cut pieces for the Harlan vests, and she worked with the focused precision she always brought to first cuts, because first cuts determined everything that followed. Her hands did not shake. She did not expect them to. Shaking hands were for after, and she intended to be done and asleep long before after arrived. Tuesday, Buck Dillon came in on the regular supply run from the North Road. She was waiting on the boardwalk with the first 8 completed vests stacked and wrapped in the cotton cloth she used for delivery. He came off the wagon and looked at the stack, and then at her face, in that order, and the order told her something about what he was actually reading when he looked at her. She told him about the wall, flat clear, in the same sequence in which it had happened. The sound in the night, the gate, the pitch mark at the foundation. Buck was still for the span of 3 full breaths. Not surprised. Confirmed was the better word, the expression of a man whose expectation has been met in a direction he had hoped it would not go. You tell Ward? He asked. Or Ames? Sheriff Ames was a competent man, but his jurisdiction ended at the county line, and what she had described was not yet a crime that could be prosecuted, being a mark on a wall and a swinging gate and a sound in the dark. I'm telling you, she said, because you told me to be watchful and I was, and this is what I found. He understood what that meant. He looked at the east wall of the workshop from where they stood, running the geometry of approach and exit in his head, the alley angle, the gate, the line of sight from the main street. He picked up the vests, examined the stitching on the top one, with his thumb the way he had examined the sample, and settled them under his arm. I'll pass it along. I'm not asking for anything. I know you're not. He put the vests in the wagon. He looked at her, once more, with something in the lower register of his expression that she had to look for carefully, but that was there when she found it. Good work on the collars. He'll complain. He'll complain less than if they sat wrong. Buck said nothing else. He climbed up and gathered the lines and drove out, and she watched the wagon go, and thought about the geometry. He had been reading the alley, the gate, the approach in darkness, and thought about a man who had catalogued the location of a thrown key from the position of a person chained to a post, and thought that those two things were not unrelated. 4 days after Buck's visit, a letter arrived in the afternoon post. It came in a plain envelope with no return address, her name on the outside in a hand she had never seen before, cramped and angular, the writing of a man who pressed hard with the pen. She opened it at the workshop table after supper. 1 sentence. If you mean to stand before the county court at Amarillo, understand that the next time it will not be a wall. She read it twice, folded it, put it in the back of the order book, behind the bills, in front of the Denver letter, which she had moved to the order book from the tin box sometime in the last 2 weeks, without having made a conscious decision to do so. She sat at the table, not for a long time. She allowed herself exactly the time it took to finish her coffee, which was 4 or 5 minutes, and she used that time to think through the situation with the same approach. She brought to a complicated pattern. What were the pieces? What were the relationships between them? What did the finished thing need to look like? Wade Cutter had chained 4 men to posts on Cimarron Trail. She had unchained them. She had seen his face. He knew she had seen his face. He had come to the base of her wall with a pitch torch to tell her he could reach her here, and now he had written it down, which was a degree of confidence that told her he did not believe she had anyone standing behind her. She thought about that. She thought about her father's hands, the way they sat at rest on his thighs after work, open flat, not braced or gripped. She had thought for years that this was simply how his hands rested. She understood now that it was a decision. Open hands were a posture a person chose. You chose to open them even when everything in the situation suggested you should close them and hold on. She finished her coffee, washed the cup, went to bed. She woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of hooves on the main street, a single horse, not hurrying, going south, and lay still and listened until the sound faded and then went back to sleep. In the morning she was measuring the 12th vest against the pattern when she heard the side door. She had locked it. She was certain of that, the mechanical certainty of a person whose evening routine was fixed and whose hands performed it without requiring attention. She looked at the door. It was standing open. Not broken, the latch was intact, the frame undamaged. The lock had been worked from outside, which required either a key she had not given to anyone or a degree of skill with a pick that spoke to a specific kind of history. She stood still, looked at the room. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared different from the night before except the door and the thing on the cutting table that had not been there when she left it. Her leather satchel. She had kept it under the work table since returning from Cimarron Trail, because that was where she put things she used regularly, but not constantly. It was sitting on top of the cutting table, open. Inside it, her fabric knife, her measuring tape, a new D-ring strap in good brown leather, with close even stitching along both edges and a brass buckle that was quality hardware, not the stamped kind that failed in a season. She picked it up, turned it over. On the underside of the buckle tongue, pressed into the leather with a small stamp, 8 points, arranged like compass directions, small enough that you would not see it unless you were looking, clear enough that once you saw it you could not unsee it. She sat down on the cutting stool. She sat there for a while, not long enough to call it anything other than taking the time to think clearly, which was what she was doing. She was thinking clearly about a man who had come into her locked workshop in the dark and left a handmade D-ring strap, with his mark on the underside of the buckle, where no one would see it, unless they were the person who used it, and who had then left, without leaving any other evidence of his presence. She was not going to make this into something it was not. She was also not going to pretend it was nothing. She put the strap in the satchel and buckled it and stood up. She looked at the open door, at the latch that had been worked from outside, at the clean, empty cutting table. She thought about a man who had spent 30 years operating in the panhandle, and who knew, evidently, how to open a lock without a key, and who had used that skill, not to take something but to leave something, and who had left no note, no explanation, nothing that could be received as pressure or obligation, just the strap, with the compass star where only she would find it. She went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the east window and looked at the mark on the foundation of the workshop wall, visible from this angle if the light was right, which it was at this hour, the morning sun coming in low from the east and catching the dark smear at a shallow angle that made it visible as a shadow. 2 men, she thought. One who came in the dark and held fire to the base of her wall. One who came in the dark and left something she needed marked with the thing he stood for. She thought, I know which one I am dealing with. She thought, I also know which one is more complicated. She was still at the window with her cooling coffee when the knock came at the front door. Not the workshop side door. The front door, proper hours, proper announcement. She dried her hands and went through. Cole Harlan stood on the front step with his hat in his hands. He had not come by the side door today. He had come to the front door at 7 in the morning and knocked. She looked at him. He looked at her. Your lock, he said. My lock, she agreed. I can have a better one sent from Amarillo. The kind that requires a specific key pattern, that would be useful. She opened the door wider. Come in. He came into the front room and stood in the center of it, and she went to the kitchen and poured in a second cup of coffee and brought it back and handed it to him, and he took it without making anything of it, which was the right response. Cutter sent a letter, she said. He did not look surprised when, 4 days ago, he knows about the county court in Amarillo. The circuit judge comes through on the second Tuesday of August. He held the cup with both hands, a habit she had not seen from him before, and she thought it was a cold morning habit that came from years of range work and persisted regardless of the season. The federal marshal has been building a case against Cutter for 11 months. What you saw on Cimarron Trail completes it. And if I testify, 25 years in a federal penitentiary, his operation shuts down. The corridor roads become safe for every freighter and small rancher between here and the Oklahoma territory. She looked at the coffee in her own cup. And if I don't? He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the answer, respecting her enough to let the question breathe. If you don't, he said, nothing changes. The marshal's case is incomplete without a civilian witness. Cutter knows the law well enough to know what he can defend against and what he can't. He's been a lawman. He set his cup on the mantle. He'll stay in the county. He'll keep his arrangement on the corridor roads. And he'll know that you chose not to testify, which will tell him something about what he can and cannot do. She thought about the pitch mark on the east wall, about the sentence in the letter, about the gate swinging in still air. He already knows I'm alone here, she said. Yes, she looked at him. You knew before Buck came back and told you. You knew when you came through with the fabric and the list. He did not deflect. I had Buck watching the road from Harlan Ranch. He reported movement south of the county line consistent with Cutter's operation, 3 days after we left Redstone Creek. He looked at her steadily, without apology, without the performance of apology. I came with the fabric because I had a contract to honor, and because I wanted to see for myself that you were all right. She absorbed this. You could have told me. Yes, why didn't you? Because you would have told me. That didn't need watching, and you would have been correct, and then we would have spent the con discussing your autonomy instead of whether the collar rise needed adjusting on the vests for men with short necks. He looked at her without any adjustment to his expression. I chose the vests. She considered this for a moment. It was, she had to acknowledge, internally consistent. That was presumptuous. It was practical. I apologize for the presumption. She looked at the front window, the early morning light coming through the glass. I need to get to Amarillo. I know. I need to get there safely, and I need to be able to stand in front of a county court and say what I saw without someone having reached me before I get there. Yes. Can you make that happen? He picked up his cup, drank, set it down. I can ride with you, Buck and Ray and Jed as well. 4 Harlan Ranch riders on the county road to Amarillo draws no particular attention. We travel that road regularly for land office business. He looked at her. Cutter has men watching the roads, but he doesn't have enough of them to watch all of them and manage his operations simultaneously. If we choose the right day and the right route, we reach Amarillo without event. She thought about this. About the mathematics of it, what she needed, what he was offering. Whether what he was offering was what it appeared to be, or something more complicated that would require more from her than she was prepared to give. It appeared to be what it appeared to be. A man with the resources and the men and the road knowledge to get her to Amarillo safely, offering those things because the situation called for them and because he had a direct interest in the outcome of the trial, not charity. Alignment, when do we leave, she said. Saturday before light. 3 days to Amarillo on the South County Road, which Cutter uses less frequently than the Cimarron corridor. 1 day for the trial, 3 days back. I'll need Sunday to prepare. Saturday week then. Before light. She nodded. I'll be ready. He finished the coffee. He looked around the front room. Not the searching look of a man looking for something specific, but the inventory of a man who is noting the condition of a place he is responsible for, which was not a responsibility she had assigned him, but which he appeared to have assigned himself. She was not going to address that directly. Not today. The new lock, she said. I'll have it sent by Thursday, thank you. He put his hat on, moved toward the door, stopped. Because that was apparently something all the Harlan men did at doors, something structural about the way they departed. You'll want your satchel for the road. She looked at him. His expression gave nothing. But the compass star ring caught the morning light for a moment as he turned the doorknob. 8 points. Brief and clear. The strap holds better if you condition the leather before a long ride, he said. There's a tin of oil in the left saddlebag on Pepper. Ruth will know where she keeps it. He went out. She stood in the front room of Hollis House and listened to his horse move away from the building and down the street, and she thought about a man who had come through a locked door in the dark to leave something useful in her satchel and who then came to the front door in daylight and told her how to care for it, and who had managed to do both of those things without asking her for a single word of acknowledgement. She thought, that is a man who has learned to give without requiring receipt. She thought, I do not know where a person learns that. She went back to the workshop. On the cutting table, the 12th vest was waiting, the collar piece pinned and ready for the machine. She sat down and adjusted the fabric under the presser foot and began to sew, and the sound of the needle and the rhythm of the wheel were the sounds she had worked under for 3 years in this room, steady and purposeful, and they were still those sounds, and the work was still that work, and nothing about the morning had changed those facts, except that her satchel was on the table beside her, with a new D-ring strap buckled through the yoke fitting, and on the underside of the buckle tongue, if you turned it over and knew where to look, 8 points held their positions like directions that had not changed, and would not change regardless of what the country around them did. She sewed. Outside, the panhandle morning went about its business, broad and indifferent and very old, the sky doing what it always did, which was everything at once. and nothing you could hold in your hands. And somewhere 3 days southeast of Redstone Creek, a county courthouse was waiting with a circuit judge and a jury box, and a case that would be decided in part by what one woman had seen on one afternoon in July, when she had stopped to listen to a sound that no one else on Cimarron Trail had stopped for. She would get there. That was not a question she was entertaining. She would get there, and she would stand in that room, and she would say what she had seen, and the saying of it would be the same thing it had always been: not heroism, not performance, not anything that required a name larger than the thing itself. Just a person telling the truth about what they had witnessed, because the truth existed, and the telling of it mattered, and the not telling of it was a choice she was not available to make. She thought about milepost 7, the way the country opened when you came around the limestone shelf. The size of it. The afternoon light at that spot coming in from the southwest, and turning everything gold and a little larger than itself. Her father had always stopped there, so had she. She was going to stop there again on the way back from Amarillo. But first she had 8 vests left to finish and 7 days to finish them in, and the needle was moving and the work was in front of her, and the morning was fully underway. She kept sewing. The road to Amarillo was not a road that forgave inattention. 3 days southeast through the Panhandle meant 3 days of terrain that changed its character without warning. Red clay flats giving way to limestone breaks, the breaks opening into stretches of short grass that went to the horizon in every direction, without a single vertical feature to anchor your eye, then mesquite again. Then a dry creek bed that required a crossing at a point where the banks were shallow enough for the horses, then more flat grass. The sky was enormous and active. Clouds built in the south every afternoon and came nothing of most days and everything of a few. And you could not tell from 1 hour to the next which kind of day you were having until the light changed or didn't. Elsa rode in the position she had negotiated without speaking, not at the front, which belonged to Cole and Buck, who knew the route, and not at the back, which was where Fowler and Kettridge rode with their attention on what was behind the party. She rode third, on the left side of the column, with Ray Sutton at her elbow and Jed Marsh behind her, and the road visible ahead for a 1/4 mile before the column reached it. The first day they made 20 miles before the light went wrong, a purpling at the western edge, that meant the kind of dark that came fast on the Panhandle, when the cloud cover arrived, and Cole brought the party off the road to a shallow draw with a stand of cottonwood at the south end, and enough firewood from the deadfall to last the night. They had a fire small enough not to be seen from the road. Fowler and Doyle took first watch without being asked, which told her everything she needed to know about how this group operated. She sat apart from the men after supper, not because she was unwelcome and not to make a point, but because she genuinely preferred it. She had her satchel, and inside the satchel was the order book, with the Denver letter behind the front cover and the 2 bills behind the letter. And she took the letter out and held it without opening it and looked at the fire. She heard Cole's boots in the dirt before he sat down, because his boots were the kind of boots that did not change their sound regardless of how quietly the man wearing them was trying to move, which was a function of weight and sole thickness, and had nothing to do with intention. He sat on the other side of the fire, not close, the fire between them. Neither of them said anything for a while. The cottonwoods were making the sound they made in a light wind, the dry clatter of leaves on the verge of turning, a sound that belonged to the particular season between summer heat and first cold, when Texas couldn't decide what it was doing and the nights got complicated before the days caught up. You've been holding that letter for 20 minutes without opening it. Not accusatory, observational. She looked at the letter. I know what it says. Then why carry it? She thought about that. The honest answer was available to her if she wanted to use it. But honesty on this subject felt like handing over something she had not finished deciding about yet. She tried a partial version. It helps to know it's real. He was quiet. The letter says I can go, she said. It says the place exists. It says there's a room there with my name on a list, and a set of courses that nobody in Redstone Creek can teach me. And 2 years of work on the other side of which I would know how to do things I can currently only approximate. She looked at the fire. I know all of that. I just sometimes I need to feel the paper. He did not fill the space. She was learning that about him. He had enough patience to leave space unfilled, which was rarer than it should have been, and more valuable than most people knew. My wife kept a letter, he said finally. Not quickly. The words came at the pace of something that had been underground a long time and was moving upward through rock. Not a letter she received. A letter she wrote to her sister in Kansas. She never sent it. I found it after February. The fire shifted, a log settled. She wrote that she had wanted to go north when she was young, before we married. She had a friend in Wichita who had started a dress business and had written to Margaret asking her to come and be her partner. She had written back and said no because she was already engaged to me and going north seemed impossible. He looked at his hands. The compass star ring caught no light at all in the dimness, just a shape on his finger. She never told me. In 14 years she never told me. Elsa said nothing. I don't know if she regretted it. The letter didn't say that. It just said she had wanted to go. He was quiet for a moment. I found it in February, 2 weeks after we buried her, and I have thought about it every day since. She looked at the letter in her own hands. What did you do with hers? I sent it to her sister. 11 years late. He looked at the fire. She wrote back. Said Margaret had been the better businesswoman anyway, and the shop would have gone under in a year. Something moved in Elsa's chest that was not quite a laugh, and not quite grief, but had elements of both, and she did not try to categorize it. I'm going, she said. Not to him specifically. To the air, to the fact. Whatever happens in Amarillo and whatever happens after, I'm going to Denver, I know. He said it without hesitation, which was the version of the statement that cost something to make. She put the letter back in the satchel. Neither of them moved for a while. The fire burned down and Buck rebuilt it without ceremony, and the night came in properly, star-thick and very dark. The panhandle sky doing what it did when the clouds cleared, which was to remind you that you lived on a small round thing, moving through something so large the numbers describing it were not numbers anyone could actually think. She slept better that night than she had in 2 weeks. The second day they crossed Cimarron Trail at milepost 12, as she had known they would. The crossing was fast. The column moved through the intersection at a trot, no reason to pause, and she did not look south toward milepost 7, and she did not think about the canyon directly, but her hand on the reins felt the D-ring strap through the leather, and she pressed her thumb against it for a moment, and that was enough. Midday of the second day, 6 miles from the Potter County line, Cole brought the column to a stop on a rise above a shallow valley and looked at something to the southeast. Elsa pulled up beside him. In the valley, 3 men on horseback sat their horses at a widening in the trail where 2 tracks met. They were not moving. They were looking at the Harlan party, on the rise the way men look at something, when they are trying to determine whether it is a problem or an opportunity. Buck was already talking to Cole in the low register they used when they were discussing something they did not want the group to hear. Cole's expression had not changed. It did not change much in general, but in the moments when it mattered most it became absolutely still, which was its own kind of change. Ray came up on Elsa's right. Cutter men, he said. Not a question. She looked at the 3 riders. From this distance she could see the horses were good, not ranch horses, not the working stock she was used to seeing on the panhandle roads. Better, faster. The kind of horses you rode when you expected to need to leave somewhere quickly or pursue someone and wanted to be sure of the outcome. Cole turned to look at her. Direct, unambiguous. We go around. There's a line shack road 2 miles back that cuts east and meets the Amarillo track above the valley. It adds half a day. It adds half a day, yes. She looked at the 3 riders in the valley. She looked at Buck, who was ready, and Fowler, who had moved his rifle to a position of readiness that was not threatening, but was not casual. She looked at Cole. How many roads does Cutter own between here and Amarillo? He understood what she was asking. He doesn't own any of them. He watches all of them. Then going around buys time, not safety. It buys a day. A day is something. It's also a message. She looked at the 3 men in the valley. It says we can be redirected. It says we respond to his geography. Cole looked at her. She looked back. We go through the valley. A beat, you're sure? No, honest. But I'm going to Amarillo and I'm going through the valley. He looked at her for 1 more second. The full reading quality of it. The kind of attention that takes in more than the surface of a thing and does not pretend otherwise. Then he turned to Fowler and said 2 words. Ride through. They went down into the valley at a walk, not a trot, not a canter. Walking pace, unhurried. The way a party of 8 riders moves when they are not worried about the 3 men on horseback at the trail junction. The 3 men watched them come. As the Harlan party reached the widening of the trail, the middle rider said something to the other two, and they held their ground, and the Harlan party went past them at the same walking pace, 8 sets of hooves on the clay road, and nobody said a word to anybody. 50 yards past the junction, Ray exhaled audibly. "Steady," Cole said. Not loud, it was not a command, it was a reminder. Like the difference between a fence and a gate. They did not look back, they went on up the road. Elsa did not release the breath she was holding until they crested the next rise, and the valley was behind them. Then she released it quietly, into the space between her and Pepper's neck, and Pepper flicked an ear back in response. "Good girl," she said to the horse, who had earned it. They reached Amarillo the afternoon of the 3rd day, coming in from the northwest on the county road that became the main street of the town, a proper wide-cut street with a wood sidewalk and brick storefronts, and the 3-story bulk of the Potter County Courthouse at the far end, its limestone facade the color of old cream in the afternoon light. Amarillo was not a large city, but it was substantially larger than anything in Elsa's daily geography, and it had the quality of concentrated commerce, of people moving with purpose, of more things happening per square foot than she was used to. Buck had arranged rooms at the Malone House, a respectable establishment on the east side of the main street, with a proprietress who knew Buck by name and had, from the quality of her greeting, and the speed with which the rooms were produced, been forewarned by a telegram she was gracious enough not to mention. Elsa's room was on the 2nd floor, south-facing, clean, with a window that looked out over the back garden and the rooftops of the buildings behind the main street and the wide, flat sky beyond them. She stood at the window for a moment after Buck showed her up and left the key. Outside the window, the sky was still going, clouds building in the northwest, the light changing with them, the Texas sky she had lived under her whole life, still going the way it always went, and that still, sometimes, stopped her. She unpacked her satchel, hung her second-hand blouse and skirt, the better ones, saved for the court appearance, on the hook on the back of the door, set the order book on the small desk, the Denver letter visible now through the open cover, which she had stopped hiding from herself at some point in the last 3 days, without precisely noticing when. She washed her face and hands in the basin and looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand. 3 days on the road, her hair needed attention. Her face had caught more sun than she usually allowed. She looked, she thought, like a person who had ridden a long way with intention and was not done yet, which was accurate. The county court opened at 8 the following morning. She slept. The courtroom of the Potter County Courthouse was a large room, by the standard of anything Elsa had been in, with high plaster ceilings and tall windows along the south wall that let in the morning sun in parallel bars of light that moved across the floor as the hours passed. The public gallery was filling when they arrived at 7:45. She had not expected this. The number of people, the fact that a criminal trial in Amarillo in August drew an audience, but she understood when she thought about it. Wade Cutter had operated along the Cimarron corridor for 2 years. He had operated against a great many people in 2 years. The people he had operated against had neighbors and kin, and they had all come to watch. The bench was mahogany, polished, 3 feet high. Judge Rowan Fitch sat behind it, a man in his 60s with the broad face of someone who has heard everything and decided most of it. He had been on the circuit for 19 years, according to Buck, who had appeared in his court 3 times over the years on various Harlan Ranch matters. He was fair. He was quick. He did not tolerate delay. Wade Cutter sat at the defense table. She had not seen him since the canyon. She had seen his face then for approximately 4 seconds at a distance of 40 yards, which was less time and more distance than would seem adequate for the certainty of identification. But she was certain. She had been certain since the moment her eyes had found him on the ridge and registered everything about him in the automatic inventory of a person who pays attention as a matter of course. The lean line of him, the low hat, now replaced by no hat at all in deference to the court. The pale eyes which from across the courtroom had the quality of washed-out sky, the color of something that had once been a deeper shade and had spent too long exposed to weather. He looked at her. Across the courtroom directly, without any attempt to obscure the fact of the looking. She looked back. She did not look away first. She looked at him with the same quality of attention she brought to a burn mark at the base of a wall, to a knot in a length of cord, to a seam that was going to fail before the garment was ready for it. She looked at him as if he were a problem she was in the process of solving. Which was, she thought, exactly what he was. His lawyer was a man named Harlan Weiss from the county seat in Canyon, brought in specifically for this trial and visibly expensive, the kind of expense that showed in the fit of the coat, and the quality of the boots, and the precise unhurriedness of his movements in the courtroom, the professional ease of a man who charges by the hour and has no incentive to be fast. Elsa was the first witness called after the marshal's opening testimony. She sat in the witness chair, which was to the right of the judge's bench, and faced the courtroom directly, the public gallery before her, and the defense table at her right and the jury box at her left. She put her hands in her lap and looked at the prosecutor, a county man named Stroud, with a wide forehead and an organized manner, and answered his questions. She described what she had seen on Cimarron Trail, in the precise order in which she had seen it. The 4 men at the posts, the chains, the positions of the riders she had observed leaving the scene, 3 of them moving south, and 1 of them on the ridge above the canyon on the right side, the eastern ridge, which was where the trail below could be observed in full. She described the man on the ridge, his height, his build, his clothing, the particular way he sat his horse, the horse not moving, the rider not moving, the stillness of a man who is choosing not to be conspicuous and has settled into that choice. She described the moment she had identified the face when she looked up, which she had done once and briefly, because there had been a hawk circling above the ridge, and her eye had followed it up naturally and found the man behind it, a hawk. She had not planned to see him, she had simply looked up and he was there. Weiss let her finish. He did not rise immediately. He looked at his papers for a moment, the practiced pause of a man who understands that allowing silence to expand is its own form of pressure. Then he stood. Miss Reed, he adjusted his coat. You have described observing a man on a ridgeline at what distance? 40 yards approximately, perhaps 45. At 40 to 45 yards, in bright afternoon light that would have been coming from the west and falling directly into your eyes as you looked up. He paused. For how long did you observe this man? 4 seconds, approximately. 4 seconds. He repeated it with the patience of someone turning a coin over to show the other side. Miss Reed, who taught you to measure seconds with such precision. The gallery was not entirely quiet. A few sounds, not laughter, something closer to the recognition of a technique being employed. My father, she said. He worked in a mine. Underground, you can't see anything. You count. If you practice counting seconds long enough, you know how long a second is. The gallery was fully quiet. Your father. Weiss shifted. He had heard this already, presumably in the pre-trial preparation. He was moving to another line. You are currently under contract to Harlan Ranch. Is that correct? Yes. The contract was offered by Cole Harlan, one of the alleged victims in this case. The contract was offered and I accepted it. It is a standard commercial arrangement for services rendered. Services rendered to the man who employs you. Services rendered in exchange for payment. I make clothing. He purchases it. This is how commerce functions. She looked at Weiss directly. I have 12 independent clients in Redstone Creek who can confirm the nature and quality of my work. My arrangement with Harlan Ranch is not different in kind from those arrangements. Weiss moved on. He moved through 3 more angles: the distance, the duration of observation, the fact that she had been simultaneously engaged in a complex physical task, and therefore could not have devoted full attention to the ridgeline, the time of day, and the direction of the light. She answered each one. She did not elaborate beyond what was asked. She did not anticipate his next point. She answered the question that was put to her and stopped and waited for the next one, which was the technique of a person who understands that elaboration is where lawyers find the leverage they are looking for. Then he pivoted. Miss Reed, you have described yourself as residing in a room at the back of a commercial establishment in Redstone Creek. His tone was still, considered, not aggressive, which made it more effective, not less. You have no family in that town, no property, no husband. You are, to use the term the law uses, a woman without a principle. He looked at his papers. Without a person responsible for your standing as a reliable witness in the courts of this county. The courtroom was absolutely quiet. Not the quiet of people listening. The quiet of people holding themselves very still because the air had changed. Your testimony in this proceeding concerns an action taken against 4 men, one of whom now employs you. and your ability to make that identification rests entirely on your own account of what you saw in a moment lasting 4 seconds, uncorroborated by any other witness. He clasped his hands. The court must be asked to consider whether, without the formal standing of a principal to speak to her character, this witness's testimony can be said to carry sufficient weight to the sound of a chair, not loud, not dramatic. A chair moving on a wood floor, the sound of someone standing up. Cole Harlan rose from the front row of the public gallery. He did not look at Weiss. He did not look at the jury. He looked at Judge Fitch directly, with the steadiness of a man addressing another man on a matter of fact. Your Honor. His voice carried the room without effort, not because he raised it, because it was a voice that had spent 30 years carrying across open range and through wind and rain, and the ambient noise of 4,000 head of cattle. And it had developed a quality of clarity that rooms did not diminish. I am Cole Harlan, registered property holder in Potter and Wheeler and Haskell counties, with a principal standing in this court on record since 1871. I formally attest to the character and reliability of Miss Elsa Reed as a witness. I ask that the court record my attestation. Fitch looked at him over the rims of his glasses. Mr. Harlan, the court acknowledges your standing. Sit down. Cole sat down. Weiss looked at his papers. He looked at the jury. He looked at the judge. He adjusted his coat. He said no further questions. Elsa sat in the witness chair for a moment after Weiss sat down. She was aware of the room, the gallery, the jury box, the bar. Would you treat them with kindness? The defendant's table where had been looking at Cole Harlan with his pale, washed-out eyes, with an expression that was not visible from the witness chair, but that she could reconstruct from everything she knew about him, the way you reconstruct a thing from its negative space. Then she stepped down. She walked back to the row where Buck and Ray and Jed were seated. She sat. Ray looked at her sidelong and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. She did not look at Cole. She would look at him later. Right now she was still in the working part of the morning, the part where you finish what you started before you let yourself feel it. The jury was out for 2 hours. She spent those 2 hours in the anteroom off the main corridor of the courthouse, drinking the worst coffee she had encountered in her life, which was the courthouse coffee, and going through the remaining measurements in Buck handwrite and calculating the fabric she still needed for the back half of the order. Buck watched her do this with the expression that was his version of being impressed, which was no expression at all, but a stillness that meant something different from his ordinary stillness. When the jury came back, she was still doing the calculations. She closed the order book when the clerk came to the door. The verdict was read in a room that had become, in the 2 hours of the jury's deliberation, more full rather than less full, the way rooms do when a decision is pending, when people who had gone for lunch, or air, or a walk around the block have all drifted back, because the courthouse has a gravity that increases as a verdict approaches. Wade Cutter stood when the foreman rose to read guilty. All counts. 25 years in the federal penitentiary, the sentence to run consecutively on all charges. Wade Cutter did not look at Elsa when the verdict was read. He looked at Cole Harlan. He held Cole's gaze for 3 seconds with his pale eyes, and then the deputies were beside him. And it was over, and people were standing and moving, and the sound of the room coming back to itself after a long-held breath was the sound of 200 people exhaling at once. She stood in the middle of it, and felt the room around her, the settled feeling of a thing that has been concluded the way a piece of finished work sits, when the last seam is closed, and the last thread is cut, and nothing remains undone. Outside, on the courthouse steps in the afternoon light, people came to her. She was not prepared for it. She was prepared for the verdict, and the aftermath, and the ride back, and the workshop, and the order, and the calculations. But she was not prepared for the woman who came first, 50, heavy-set, in a dark dress with mended cuffs that Elsa noticed because she noticed such things, who took her hand and held it in both of hers and said, "He took everything from my husband's freight wagon 2 winters ago. Everything. I thought nobody would ever." And she stopped. Then more. 7 people came in the next 20 minutes, men and women. The distances they had ridden to be here. The specific nature of what Cutter had taken from each of them, not just property, but the particular violation of knowing that someone with authority had decided you were available to be taken from, and that the road you used to feed your family was not yours to use safely. Elsa received each person with the same attention she would have brought to a measurement, which was complete and unhurried. Cole was not near her during this. He was further down the steps, talking with the marshal. She was aware of where he was without looking directly at him. The spatial sense she had developed for his presence in a room or an outdoor space, which had arrived at some point during the last 3 weeks, without announcement and without her explicit permission. When the group around her had thinned, she walked down the courthouse steps and stood on the street. He came to her, not immediately. He finished what he was saying to the marshal, and then came down the steps and stood beside her on the street, and they both looked at the afternoon. The clouds from the northwest that had been building since midday were now close enough to change the light quality, the flat bright of the full panhandle sun going layered and complex, the shadows of the clouds moving across the street in slow shapes. "Thank you," she said, "for standing up in the court. You didn't need it." "No," she looked at the moving cloud shadows, "but I'm glad you did it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've done it before. Once. For Margaret." He did not elaborate. She did not ask him to. "It is easier," he said, "to stand up for someone who would stand up for themselves." She looked at the clouds. She thought about her father's hands at rest. She thought about the workshop, the rope line, the 42 names in Buck's handwriting. She thought about the Denver letter in the satchel, the quality of the paper it was printed on, the specific sensation of holding it on the first night on the trail, when she had held it without opening it because she already knew every word and wanted to feel the fact of it being real. "I want to tell you something," she said. "The whole of it, not just the letter." He waited. "When I was 16, the year after my father died, I took in mending from all the households in Redstone Creek that would give it to me, and I used every cent of what I made to buy a structural engineering pamphlet from a mail-order catalog in Chicago. It took 3 months to arrive." She looked at the street. It was 84 pages. "I read it until I could do the calculations from memory. Then I wrote to the academy in Denver and asked what else I needed to know." She paused. They wrote back. "That was the first time anyone outside of Redstone Creek had written to me on a matter of what I was capable of." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "How long ago?" 3 years. 3 years of working toward it. 3 years of not getting there fast enough. The honest version. And then the order from Harlan Ranch, which is faster. Which is, I know what it is. I know you know what the money does. I know what it does." He turned to look at her, the full quality of it. The reading, that was not a reading anymore but something else, something she did not have a word for yet. "I also know that it's yours. Every cent of it is yours for work done. I want you to know that I know that." She looked at him. He was a large man. She had always been aware of that. In a practical sense, the size of the space he occupied, the depth of his voice, the way he had lifted Buck in the canyon, the way most men couldn't lift a saddle. But standing here on the Amarillo street in the afternoon light with the cloud shadows moving between them and the courthouse at their backs, he seemed to her not large in the way that size is sometimes a form of weight, of presence that demands accommodation, but large the way a thing is large when it is simply what it is, without pretension or excess. "When are you going?" He asked it the way he asked most things, flat, honest, without the inflection that would have made it a request. "The end of the contract." She did not look away. 8 weeks. He nodded. He was doing what she had learned he did when he was working out what to say and how to say it. The internal process that was not visible on his face but was legible in the set of his jaw, the specific quality of his stillness. "Then I'll need the order finished in 7, he said. She looked at him. "Give yourself a week to prepare. Still steady. Still at that pace of words. The Tuesday wagon before you leave can take you to the stage depot at Amarillo. From Amarillo the northbound stage runs to Dodge City, and from Dodge City the rail connects to Denver." She did not say anything. "Don't tell me you can finish in 7 weeks, he said, with the ghost at the corner of his mouth, the one she had been cataloging since the canyon. "I know you can. I've watched you work." She looked at the cloud shadows on the street. She thought about a great many things at once, which was something she could do, because her father had taught her to hold multiple calculations simultaneously, to run parallel tracks in the same mind without collision. She thought about the workshop and the rope line. She thought about the 42 vests and the 7 weeks. She thought about the train to Denver, which she had never been on, and the academy, which she had never seen, and the pamphlet in the Chicago catalog, and the letter that had come back saying she was precisely what she believed herself to be. She thought about the first night on the trail when he had told her about Margaret, and the letter Margaret had never sent, and the way his voice had carried that fact, the particular weight of a thing that has been held alone for a very long time and has finally been put down. "Ask me something," she said. Not planned. The words arrived before she had authorized them. He looked at her. "Whatever it is you've been not asking for 3 weeks." She looked at him directly. "Ask it." A pause that was longer than most of his pauses. "Will you come back?" 3 words. Flat. But not flat. Underneath the flatness was something she could hear now that she was listening for it. "When you're done, will you come back?" She thought about the canyon, about the chain coming loose, and the gray-eyed man standing up without hurrying, and looking at her the way he had been looking at her since the moment she had walked into that clearing. Not with surprise, not with gratitude, but with the specific recognition of a man who has been looking at a certain kind of problem for a long time and has just found the piece he did not know he was missing. "Yes," she said. 1 word. But she said it the way her father had said the things he meant most. Quietly, without decoration. The way a person says the thing that doesn't need anything around it to hold it up. Cole Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the street, the cloud shadows moving across it in their slow shapes, the light changing as the first clouds of the afternoon crossed the sun. He said, "Then I'll wait." They rode back to Redstone Creek over 3 days, and the return journey had a different quality from the ride out, not easier exactly, but fuller. The road was the same road. The sky was the same sky. But the thing they were carrying between them had been named, and named things have different weight from unnamed ones. Not heavier, just different. The kind of weight that is possible to carry directly, with your hands open instead of sideways and at an angle. At milepost 12, where Cimarron Trail crossed the main road, she looked south this time. She could see nothing from here. The trail curved away into the landscape and disappeared into the mesquite and the limestone breaks, and milepost 7 was 3 miles beyond the visible range, and the canyon below it further still, invisible and silent and without incident, already becoming geography rather than event, which is what time does to things that were once only themselves. She looked south. Then she looked straight ahead and rode on. They arrived in Redstone Creek on a Saturday afternoon, the column of 8 horses coming up the main street at the end of a long day, the town going about its Saturday business around them, with the mild interest of people who have seen travelers arrive before, and are curious without being urgent about it. Ruth Hollis was on the front step of Hollis House. She had her arms folded, which was her version of standing at attention, and she looked at Elsa with the comprehensive evaluation of a woman who has been managing other people's situations for 20 years, and can read a returning face like a document. "Well," she said. "He's in a federal prison," Elsa said. 25 years. Ruth unfolded her arms. "Good." She looked at Cole Harlan, and then back at Elsa, and then she went back inside without saying another word, which was the most eloquent thing Elsa had ever seen her do. The weeks that remained had the quality of something being finished well. She worked from first light to last, which was what she had always done, but now the purpose had a shape it had not had before, a specific terminus. A date in late October, when the last vest would be complete, and the last button sewn, and the work would be done, and she would pack her satchel and her composition book, and the 84-page engineering pamphlet that had started all of this, and get on the Tuesday wagon to Canyon. Cole came to Redstone Creek 3 more times during those 7 weeks. Not often, not pressing. Each time with a practical reason, the measurements for the remaining order. A question about the wool blend she had used for the vests of the men who worked in wind-exposed positions, once to deliver a letter that had arrived at Harlan Ranch by mistake for a family in Redstone Creek. Each time the visit lasted an appropriate amount of time. Each time he went back to the ranch without lingering. Each time, before he left, something was said or not said that added a line to whatever was being written between them. Quietly, without hurry, she told him, on his 3rd visit, about her father's composition book, the one in which Thomas Reed had drawn structural calculations for bridges he would never build, in the margins around the daily accounting of the blacksmith shop, the way a man makes space for the thing he loves inside the structure of the thing he does. She had found it after he died and had read it cover to cover, and had understood, for the first time, that her father had been doing in his margins what she was being given a chance to do in the center of her life. She kept the book under the pillow. She had never told anyone that. She did not know why she told Cole, except that she did, and he received it the way he received everything completely. Without elaboration, without making it smaller or larger than it was. On the last day of October, a Tuesday, she loaded the satchel and her wrapped composition book and her second blouse and skirt and the engineering pamphlet, and she stood in the workshop and looked at it. The rope line was empty, the hooks were clear, the cutting table was clean, the east wall with the burn mark at the base of the foundation stood as it had stood, the mark faded to the color of old shadow, still visible if you knew where to look, which she did. She touched it once with the tips of 2 fingers. Then she picked up her things and went out. Ruth was in the front room with a package wrapped in brown paper. She handed it to Elsa without preamble. Inside was a pair of good wool gloves, dark blue, with a practicality and a warmth calibrated to Denver winters, which were considerably more serious than anything Redstone Creek produced. I had them made in Amarillo, Ruth said. Sent for them 3 weeks ago. Don't. I wasn't going to, you were. I can see it from here. She adjusted the collar of Elsa's blouse, an unnecessary adjustment made necessary by the situation. Write me when you arrive. I will. Write me from the train. Not just when you arrive. Trains don't have mail service. Write anyway. For practice. Elsa looked at her, at the compact, efficient figure of Ruth Hollis. 20 years of running an establishment alone. Dish towel and dignity in equal measure. The woman who had wrapped her hand in a kitchen. While 4 large strangers occupied the front room and said things like, "You're bleeding on my floor," that were really saying "you matter" in a language that Elsa had been able to receive because it came without obligation attached. She put her arms around her, brief, solid. The way her father had held her, the full presence of it, nothing held back, nothing performed. Ruth's hands came up and pressed once, firm, between her shoulder blades. Then they both stepped back and neither of them said anything. And that was exactly right. The wagon was waiting. Cole Harlan was there. She had not known he was coming, and she had not asked him not to come, which was its own kind of conversation. He was standing by the wagon, not in the box, not mounted, just standing in the way he stood when he was simply present, rather than doing anything specific. He had his hat in his hands. She set her things in the wagon. She turned to him. He produced something from his vest pocket, a folded piece of paper, the kind you carry close when you carry something important. He held it out. She opened it. A letter. On Harlan Ranch stationery, his handwriting, the plain, even hand she recognized from the note about the D-ring strap. 2 paragraphs. The first outlined a standing contract with Harlan Ranch for a chief clothier position upon the completion of her studies, wages specified, terms clear, no obligation to accept. The second paragraph was shorter. He had written, "Whatever you decide when you come back, you will not come back to less than you left. I will see to that." She folded it, put it inside the satchel, next to the Denver letter, the 2 papers, side by side. She looked at him. "I made you something," she said. She had been carrying it in her pocket for a week, waiting for the moment, which was this moment. A small disc of polished mesquite wood, cut from a branch she had found behind the workshop after a windstorm in September. Sanded smooth with the sandstone she had found behind the stable. In the center of the disc, scored with the tip of her fabric knife in careful increments, 8 points. A star. Compass directions. She had made the mark the same way he wore the ring, not as decoration, as fact. He took it and turned it in his palm. His thumb moved over the carved points once. He looked at it for a long time without speaking, which was how he treated the things that mattered to him, not quickly, not with performed response, but with the full weight of his attention. He put it in his vest pocket, the left side, close to his chest. He looked at her. She did not wait for him to speak first. She did not usually wait, and she was not going to start now. "When I come back," she said, choosing the words he had used, the same words, deliberate. He heard it. She watched him hear it, the small shift in his expression that was the compass star's equivalent of all the things he did not say out loud. "When you come back," he agreed. She got into the wagon box. She did not look back when the wagon rolled out. She had said everything she needed to say and received everything she needed to receive, and looking back was for the journey home, not the journey out. She looked at the road, at the wide, flat panhandle light coming in from the east at the angle of early morning, turning everything it touched the color of new copper. At milepost 7 on Cimarron Trail, where the trail curved around the limestone shelf, and the whole country opened up in every direction. Pete Calendar had been by. She saw it as the wagon passed a small arrangement at the base of the milepost, a handful of late-season wildflowers, the dried blue of the last bluebonnets, and the orange-red of the Indian paintbrush that persisted into October, and wedged into the soil beside them a flat piece of limestone, on which someone had scratched 3 words in rough uneven letters. Someone stopped here. She read it as the wagon rolled past. She did not ask the driver to slow. She did not need more than a moment with it. 3 words and a pile of dry flowers and a piece of limestone, and the whole panhandle stretching out in every direction, and the sky above it doing what the Texas sky always did, which was everything and nothing at the same time, indifferent to human size, present to human feeling. She faced forward, she thought, my father's hands at rest. The way they looked, those hands, after work open, flat on his thighs, not clenched, not braced. The hands of a man who had finished what he was doing and had nothing to defend. She thought, that is what it looks like, not the absence of difficulty, the ability to rest when the work is done, with your hands open, because you know who you are, and you have done what you set out to do, and the rest of it, whatever it turns out to be, you will meet with those same open hands. She put her own hands in her lap, flat open. The road ran southeast toward Canyon, toward the train station, toward Denver and the academy and the 2 years she had been building toward since she was 16 years old, with an 84-page pamphlet and a composition book full of a dead man's calculations and the absolute unwillingness to become the kind of person who drives past. She rode toward it. 3 months later, when the first cold came down from the north and settled on Manhandle like a gray wool blanket, Cole Harlan sat on the front porch of the ranch house at Harlan Ranch and opened a letter that had arrived on the Tuesday wagon. Her handwriting. The same plain, careful lines, the handwriting of a person who is precise without being ornamental. She wrote about the academy, the courses, the instructors, the other women who were there with their own pamphlets and their own 3 years of preparation and their own things they knew before they were given permission to know them. She wrote about a professor named Aldous, who had been skeptical of her early and rigorous, with her longer and openly respectful by the end of the first semester, which was the order in which she preferred things to happen. She wrote about the structural load calculations she had been doing in the margins of her father's composition book for 3 years, and the morning she had put them on the board for Professor Aldous, and he had looked at them for a long time and said, without any preamble, these are correct. She wrote, I sat in that classroom and thought about a blacksmith in Redstone Creek, who drew bridges in the margins of his accounts, and I thought that the dead do not need to be present for their work to matter. I thought that the best kind of inheritance is the kind that gives you somewhere to stand. She wrote. At the end, 1 sentence, I am coming back, and I am not coming back alone. He read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in his vest pocket, left side, next to the mesquite compass disc that had been there since October and would stay there for the duration, on the porch of the ranch house, in the first cold, with the panhandle flat and gray in every direction, and the sky the color of old pewter and the wind out of the north, carrying the smell of what the next few months were going to be. Cole Harlan sat with his hands open in his lap and waited. He had waited 11 years for nothing. He could wait however long it took for everything.